Esteemed colleagues, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to participate in this, let me say, go-ahead group of luminaries from different fields, from social, humanitarian, and behavioral sciences about sustainable development, both toward the people and planet as a whole. Impact of basic science on progress is well known. People definitely understand what scientific achievements are, how they are produced, and how to interpret them. Basic science is crucial to navigate changes toward the progress in our daily lives, from climate emergency to vaccines, from gene editing to artificial intelligence tools and applications. The mission of social, humanitarian, and behavioral sciences is complementary to basic science to create the context for such strategic change and play a catalyst role in following endeavors. Topic of our panel is mutual interrelationship between basic and social sciences as prerequisite for sustainable development. Before we start discussion, let me introduce the panelists. In the center, Professor Fadwa Guindi, sitting. Fadwa is the professor of anthropology, University of California at LA, and member of the executive board of the World Academy of Art and Science. Near right side, sitting Professor Nebojsa Nakicenovic, with many positions. One of them, probably most important one, is a member of scientific committee of the European Commission. Near left side, sitting Professor Alessio Surian from Padua University, professor of psychology. My name is Dragan Đuričin. I'm professor of business economics and management, member of the advisory board of UNESCO for IIASA and the World Academy of Art and Science Fellow. We organized this panel in some sections. First part, approximately 12 minutes, is problem background. I will present this, and after that, causally and chronologically, we discussed symptoms and causalities of problems I will try to sketch within the introductory speech. No doubt that these days the troubling trends of polycrisis are spilling over into every corner of global economy and society. Construct polycrisis is maybe the best way to depict such crisis, explaining that separate crises, economic, social, climate, biotic, geopolitical, psychological, etc., simultaneously emerge, interact, and amplify each other. From the start of economic neoliberalism until today, almost half a century ago, we are witnessing one major crisis per decade and almost 500 crises of smaller intensity in the whole period. Neoliberal economic system is, shortly speaking, crisis inclined. It is based on economics rules like shareholder value maximization, deregulation, liberalization, privatization, globalization, etc., all of which created structural imbalances within the system, Moreover, imbalances are further deepened due to ineffective reaction policies based on the same policy platform or market fundamentalism, mainly unconventional and or experimental. Economic system is also exposed under the negative impact of so-called external asymmetric shocks like climate change, microbe mutations, geopolitical disputes, and echo chambers inspired destruction of social cohesion. Unlike internal or self-determined shocks, external shocks are characterized by their asymmetric nature, even though they hit all, but they hit in different intensity. Also, consequences are subtle, multiple, and hidden, namely difficult to manage. In time of polycrisis, understanding potentials of frontier technologies like AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and their synthesis is a poor, incomplete, and mostly unimplementable. Paradoxically, technological breakthroughs are perceived rather than a threat than as opportunity. To simplify at extreme, root causes of polycrisis are linear model of growth and related so-called orthodox policy platform, almost ideology of market fundamentalism as its base. So the monster of polycrisis threatening the global economy, humanity, and the planet as a whole, putting all layers of the system dynamics in terms of J. Forrester in disbalance. After financial crisis and its successor economic crisis, well known as the Great Recession of 2008, humanity entered in 2020 in biotic crisis known as COVID crisis. After biotic crisis ended, geopolitical crisis replaced them. In this stage of crisis, geopolitics become a variable inside macroeconomic equation. Consequently, some economic resources are weaponized, like uranium, precise metals, food, even American dollar, or burdened with tariffs like oil and gas, or excluded from the market like chips, altogether pushing the crisis on supply side and cost-driven inflation. In the new situation, geopolitically inspired gaps in the global economy and financial markets have been compensated by expansion of industrial military sector. Militarization is general phenomenon, and this is a pretext to wars in Ukraine, Syria, Israel, maybe EU. When that picks the level, which is more than 2 times higher than cumulative state budget on global level, geopolitically inspired militarization playing the role of a tectonic plate on global economy. Namely, the crisis is deepened again. So currently, the world economy is hanging by thread, suffering the pressure of so-called double WMD, or simultaneous pressure of the weather of mass destruction and the weapons of mass destruction. Typical structural imbalances in physical world are global warming and climate change, as well as ecosystem degradation. In biosphere, key consequences are biotic feedback loops like micropandemics, depletion of biomass reserves, and massive extinction of living organisms roughly 50% have been lost in the last 50 years. In socio-economic system, income inequality, growing indebtedness, fiscal deficit, both micro and macro, investment myopia, echo chambers bubble, distracting social cohesion, etc., are typical manifestation of multi-crisis. Despite the attention to mitigate the climate change is staying existential out of control threat, which is after 10 years of intensive occupation not definitely adequately addressed. To remember, 1.5 degrees of Celsius was target for net zero carbon emission inflection point set for 2050. Unfortunately, this target has been achieved in May 2024. Other example is recent delay of the EU target for 90% of greenhouse gases emissions reduction by 2040. As for resource depletion, we see from the graph on the next slide evident supply side challenge. Namely, socio-economic system has used all responsible resources for the year 2024 in July this year. After that, world has been credited by planet and by future generation. From the next figure, we see the list of biggest contributors to the global resource depletion based on 2024 data. We see that if people in every country in the world lived like people in the US, then global world will require 5.0 planets. As for income and wealth inequality, as another social disbalance, during poly-crisis in 100 trillion of US dollars world economy, income disparities widening deeply. Namely, top 1% in the US owned more than 45% of income and wealth. Palma Index more deeply express the problem of income concentration, comparing the income share of the richest 10% of population to that of poorest 40%. Most developed world economies have index larger than 1, whether you have income before tax or income after the tax in calculation. Social and political consequences of inequality are dramatic. Within champions of neoliberalism, 1/2 of working-age individuals shut off from the effect of macroeconomic growth during the working period. This is a source for great social frustration. In parallel with previous, neoliberal state is in radical decapitalization. For example, in the US, public wealth income ratios collapsed from year to year, from 50% from the start of neoliberalism to nearly 0% this year. Interestingly enough, owners of sovereign debt instruments, capitalistic state using to service the debt, are corporate national overclass, actually top 1%. Despite full compatibility of corporate national overclass interest with neoliberal economic rules, these rules are not in line with expectations of young generations to have equitable, sustainable, and secure socio-economic system to all. And this is another source of social frustration. At the same time, political class entered in the gladiators' fight to death, even in situation when you have two major political parties. Political leadership and corporate national overclass, both completely detached from reality, have been entered in the huge puzzle of never-ending crisis. Despite obvious unsustainability of the system, other ideas are not welcomed as a platform for system functioning or crisis mitigation. Common sense is that what is not sustainable will not endure. Now is time to match words with action, not only considering but doing something. To do that, humanity needs green transition. So we need circular model of growth in a closed world, and we need heterodox economic policy platform with two coordination mechanisms, market and state. So we see in this moment two processes under the pressure of WMD. Multi-crisis in non-linear economic system and intention for multi-transition or green transition as solution from the problem. This is all from my side, and now we can automatically change our interest on the questions and answers of the panelists in the first round, and after that of the audience. In Q&A segment, we will follow 10 minutes discussion framework per question, and we have 2 rounds of questions. We have some time more because Professor Simeunović couldn't come due to family reasons, but also we have a time more for audience to pose the questions. Let me start with Professor Nakicenovic. Nebojsa, the Antwerp Declaration is a 5-year program for EU industrial deal. This is a complementary document with the EU Green Deal and Mauro Draghi report on EU competitiveness. Mentioned documents set out a list of priorities for the EU green transition with primary aim to revitalize European industry while advancing decarbonization. From the perspective of a person familiar with the logic of R&D process on one hand, and person deeply involved in new industrialization based on climate-neutral technologies, particularly in the energy sector, do you think that this approach, which actually rejuvenate industrial policies and impact investment of the state, is capable to make exit from the crisis and substitute neoliberal paradigm?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it is very pertinent because industrialization and competitiveness is on top of the agenda everywhere in the world now. But before I attempt to respond to the question, let me just say that I'm really delighted to be in Belgrade again. Delighted we are talking about sustainability and the way forward. I was here at the meeting 3 years ago. And so I guess maybe this is a beginning of a tradition that we come here and discuss how science can contribute towards sustainability. So in attempt to respond to your question, let me just try to give a little bit broader background before I go into the detail, if I may. I would argue that Europe, and I think this is a truism, is not an island. We live in a rapidly changing world, and many of the contributors at this meeting have talked about, and you as well, about the polycrisis, deep uncertainty facing the future. I think, conflict, war, incredible suffering of people. I mean, the list is really, really long. And the question is whether this crisis, the deep crisis, could be the beginning of new. In other words, the erosion of the old, I think the wide recognition that the way forward is no longer sustainable, might be an opening for the new, for the innovations. And I think it is in this context that we have to see this discussion as well in Europe. But it is also true, I think, that Europe is in a bit of a precarious situation, at least from my personal point of view, because in some of the technologies and activities that I think are perceived to bring the future, like the digitalization, computerization, artificial intelligence, and so on, Europe is arguably lagging behind China and the United States, and I think this is one of the catalysts why this discussion has started. But I would like to go to the beginning before answering that question. If you might not be aware that we are here in the September 2025 with many anniversaries. Number one is the 2030 agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It has been 10 years since the Paris Agreement. Precious little has been achieved in my view, so much of the agenda is moving in the future, but it gives us the vision, aspirational vision, and ambitious targets where we are supposed to go. And this has all really started in some ways, at least from my perspective, with industrialization. So that's the second big anniversary, at least it's big on my agenda. 27th of September, 1825, the first steam railway went into operation, Stockton-Darlington. And there is no doubt that that's the beginning, in my view, of this process that we are involved in right now. That was the beginning of the age of steam, age of coal, age of steel, textiles, later came petrochemicals, electrification, and now we are thinking about the next revolution, I think, in industrial and in human activities associated with digitalization. So this is, I think, a really big moment to think about what we have achieved in these 200 years and whether many of these initiatives that we see in Europe and worldwide can establish a new platform for a much more sustainable, safe and just future for all over the next decades and centuries. So looking 200 years back, I think, can give us some optimism since a lot has been achieved on the way forward. And particularly, if I may, the particularly explosive was the development of the last 5 decades. People refer to that, very many people refer to that as the period of the great acceleration, because all of the human activities basically went exponential over the last 50 years. I mean, think of the 4 tigers, think of the enormous achievements in China, but clearly, exponential development does lead to singularities if we are not very careful, and that's why we are so concerned, because we are at the same time transgressing many of the Earth system boundaries. You have mentioned climate, no doubt, biodiversity, cryosphere, the list is really long. So I think it is in that context that we also have to see these attempts in Europe and elsewhere to revamp the industrialization and become more competitive. So I think this is the backdrop against which I would like to respond to your question. And if I may, I'll take a few more minutes because we have more time, I think. But before that, just one caveat. That is, I have been for the last 5 years the Chief Scientific Advisor of the European Commission. I'm rotating off this year. A group of 7 new scientists has been appointed. I think, it has been a very rich experience, but let me just say I'm speaking here entirely on my personal capacity, not on behalf of any institution, so that there is no misunderstanding. So trying to respond to this, you know, the Antwerp Declaration, R&D strategies, industrialization and competitiveness are no doubt very high on the agenda, and not just Europe, everywhere, I think. In the past, I would think that Europe had a little bit of a lighter touch in terms of the R&D strategies. And I think all of these activities you mentioned are moving in the direction of having an industrial policy, a policy how to move forward, how to invest, how to improve the competitiveness of Europe in the world. And, you know, this is a tall order. I think it's a Herculean effort if you think about it, because we have very high energy prices, we have high labor costs in Europe. That means that has to be offset something through the knowledge, through the science, through the, let's call it, you know, knowledge society that might be emerging. So there is a kind of a paradigm shift, I think, in thinking about the future, a strong paradigm shift. And perhaps, if I may, I would like to quote Joseph Stiglitz, famous economist, Nobel Prize winner, a number of years ago when he was speaking at UNIDO, the industrial organization in Vienna. He said, not having an industrial policy or development policy in general is also a policy. We shouldn't forget that. That's right. But a bad one. And so I think it is in that context that we have to see these efforts to have a strategy on the way forward. But I would also strongly argue, very strongly, and I think there is ample scientific evidence for that, that we should not attempt to pick the winners. I think this is really dangerous. And there is an element of that, in my view, in the Draghi report and the other considerations on the way forward. And the reason that I'm saying that is that I think science, engineering, technology, institutional change, all needs a diversity, in particular at the beginning. If we are at the beginning of a process of reaching sustainable future for all of us, then we have to allow for diversity. We cannot assume or have, in quotes, arrogance to think that we know exactly what needs to be done. However, and I think that was discussed at the panel before, however, I think what is important is to have a vision, is to have a positive narrative, and I think the European Green Deal does that. And so my big worry, in the context of the SDGs, I mean, European Green Deal in some ways is an interpretation of the 17 SDGs for Europe. And I think that's an ambitious and visionary way forward, but it might be endangered, maybe that's the last thing I want to say, it might be endangered by the fact that there is also movements toward militarization. So if the reindustrialization of Europe means also remilitarization, going into the old technologies rather than supporting the new things, then it might fail. And this is why I'm arguing for diversity. Because diversity, I think, is important. Inclusiveness is important. I think people, and I think that was discussed at this meeting quite amply. I think we need to, we cannot afford to be in academic islands and think that we know what the solution is. The solution is to be transparent. The process has to be transparent, how we reach it. And I think it has to be inclusive. We have to include other forms of knowledge. But I would say at the center, still, we need evidence-based science. And I would agree, and that's the topic of this meeting. My final remark might be, I think we also need integrative, holistic science. We need interdisciplinary science. Alvin Weinberg was quoted yesterday that you know, you cannot do just basic science, if I understand him correctly. You cannot just do applied science. You cannot just do humanities or medicine. You need all of it together. So we need this kind of a horizontal. I'm not arguing against the vertical, clearly. We need to have deep knowledge in various fields, but we need a horizontal. And I see that as the biggest contribution toward European industrialization, reindustrialization and competitiveness.
Okay, thank you, Nebojsa. Now we can shift focus from economics to psychology. Before I pose the question to Professor Alessio, very short intro about deeply integrated dominance habit inside humans. This habit inspired two kinds of conflicts. Conflicts with nature and conflict between people inside humanity. Negative consequences of this are visible because the planet is a closed, not open system. And if some group benefits from others, it will be only temporarily because the planet is a closed system. So my question going to be, is it possible to overcome this habit of dominance during green transition period by enhancing public trust in big science and building robust scientific culture? Is it possible at all? Okay.
I still make use of some slides.
I thought he said don't go there.
Mine is in there. Yeah. That's okay. Thank you very much. So I can just move it here? Yeah, okay. Down is forward?
Yeah. Reverse order.
Yeah.
Down is up.
So thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. Also for the privilege of coming to this sort of dialogue for the first time. And in Belgrade, that has been really pricking my attention in the past 10 months, because I don't think I've ever experienced from a distance such an effort and persistent in direct democracy as the students in this country have attempted ever since the 1st of November of last year. And what I would answer in this case, I think, is facilitated by what has just been said, not only here, but also before me in the previous days and this morning, particularly by Feng Shan, when he was reminding us of how tricky and sometimes ambiguous it is to talk of innovation. Of course, when we work and get money from the European Commission, everything is about innovation, and we continuously innovate formally. But really, it is maybe in the political, in the sense that Feng Shan beautifully introduced, that in the political sense that we might seek an answer, which I don't think is yes or no, unless you're looking for the shortcut, the type being eat the rich. Then okay, if we all agree that enough is enough. But I'm a non-violent person, and I always think as a psychologist and a music therapist that there are better ways, of course. So in this title, you can see that I'm trying to make and share some references from, let's say, not only psychology, but the type of psychology that pays attention to education. And when among our own discipline we say cultural, historical, tradition, I write here approach in the broad sense, we're very specific. We mean that basically two scientists, Luria, but specifically Vygotsky in the Russia of the late 20s, beginning of the 30s, came with a focus that was unexplored before, that has a lot to do with this conference, bringing together, in fact, also different sciences. So from neurology to paying attention to not only the social and cultural context in general, but the specific opportunities that your family, your school, your teacher, your trainer is offering to you, your children, and the children that are growing up together with your child. So it's a bit like we were invited to do concerning CO2, getting into the specific room. We have this global picture, but then what is the quality of air for everybody, but also for specifically the diversity that we have. That's what cultural, historical approach is meant to communicate. When we create opportunities, we have to acknowledge that different people will profit from those opportunities in different ways. So doing just one solution for all, it's not providing equity, it's not providing justice. And here we try to connect this approach to learning and sustainability. And I must say, then we have to put this very important work that the Club of Rome back in 72, in 79 did, with at least two other, I think, international agreements that are in place. One since 74 and just renewed at the end of 2023. It is a UNESCO recommendation, worldwide agreement on education for international understanding, for cooperation, for human rights, for peace, and at the end of 2023, also for sustainability, with a focus on environment that back then it was kind of neglected. Mind you, 74 is just 2 years after the Stockholm conference. It was the beginning of this environmental awareness. I'm mentioning that because it means we have 50 years of monitoring, of discussing this, but little attention from, let's say, the political arena. And also, we've been discussing a lot technologies here. Back then, it was very clear that something had to be done to bring children in formal education, youth in formal education, in contact with each other across border. And I think those of us who had that opportunity, I'm old enough to have written, letters or compiled a short introduction in different languages to pupils, sorry about that, in other parts of the world. That, I think, has been a fundamental process for some of us in terms of cross-cultural learning. It's amazing how that has been reduced to pilot projects and not to a structural kind of focus on pupils as researchers. And my short answer would be, yes, if we go back and think that not just us that are entitled professionally to do that, but each human being is a researcher, and that no education process is to be called an education process if it doesn't start from each of us individually and collectively in that arena as researchers. I mean it very seriously, not just as, compile something from Wikipedia. Then, for me, my background is music therapist. It's always very tempting to create bridges between my two professions. And I would say, essentially, all artists pay attention, observe, get some kind of emotional resonance from the environment, exactly as scientists do. And then what we also have in common is some level, sometimes a high level of creativity. A cultural historical tradition focuses specifically on what type of art and science is kind of up to terms with the world we are living in. So this, for example, gets my attention as effective, as something we need to remind ourselves to do something about in a creative way. Okay. And I'm going to share very rapidly some references. I've learned a lot from what was previously shared in these 2 days. Here, just reminding ourselves, very beginning of the 20th century, Maria Montessori in Rome, paying attention to those excluded from the educational process, put a very simple aim to education for all, peace. Not to teach children peace, but to listen from children, how do they construct peace? And to do that, creating educational environment that respect their autonomy as much as possible. After the First World War, the Freinet family, Célestin, Elise, back then, the housing crisis was not what it is today, were able, as people shocked by the First World War, very normal people, to acquire a piece of land in the south of France, and within, until today, the French school system to establish a school for peace, to establish pupils as protagonists of their own educational process, and to link with other pupils. A few years later, Munir Fashe comes back from the very MIT that was instrumental to the Club of Rome to Palestine, because as a mathematician, he understands that type of education is not promoting peace, unfortunately. Now, I think No Limits to Learning has been very instrumental in posing a right perspective in the key role of participation in sustainable societies. And this participation is essentially something different from just informing or consulting. It is a matter of power. It is a matter of acknowledging that there is a democracy that you can delegate, but also a democracy that is horizontal and sees everybody who's taking part in a decision-making activity to have power. That, I think, has a bit disappeared from our own radar. We forgot that people are not feeling responsible because we never asked people in the first place to take decision feeling that their own position and their own decision counts, that they have a responsibility about that. How can I be held responsible for something when it's systematically somebody else who's taking the decision? So there is something here that psychology have very clear, and it is dimension, scale, something we share with geographers, with historians. And especially at the small scale, in small groups, we need to be acknowledged both in terms of our own specificities, that's an educational responsibility, but also in terms of the collaboration that we establish with other people in conditions where that is significant. And it is significant when I actually exercise the amount of power that is exactly the same for the others. Schools are not generally conducive to this type of an environment, and it's dramatic, as we have discovered. Read the latest polls about what young people in Europe think of democracy, of their system, of the European Union, and it's scary. For the first time, we have kind of half of the youth population that think, yeah, democracy, that's the model. The rest is, this failed, this is not serving, let's look for other system, let's look for some guy who is reliable. That's a scary scenario. And that's very much also the product of our own schools. Not schools in theory, the schools in practice. So at the heart of a cultural historical approach, there is a dialogic approach. The recognition also that not just in terms of dialoguing with the others, which is important, but dialoguing with myself. I learn from those who are important in my life, family, friends, fools. What is conditioning me at every moment, and sometimes what I need to unlearn, to deconstruct in order to establish a different dialogue with others. And I would say, let's nurture a little bit this dimension. I think it was just legitimized a moment ago. Let's unlearn, which doesn't mean we throw away things, but we are able to get new data and reframe what we previously learned. This is vital today. And when we're talking about militarizing our own economy, we are talking about militarizing our own culture, then I think unlearning is crucial, and it requires an active effort to actually not just finding a theoretical common ground, not to think that because we have established documents, we are safe, but negotiate, in fact, on equal grounds. So this goes back to how do we nurture intellectual humility and co-creation. And what I will focus, I think, thanks to the next question, is going to be co-creation. Very briefly, I just want to have a very little, probably very partial example of what I mean by cultural humility. You, I don't think, are familiar with this. This is the product of what is quoted over and over again as critical and democratic education. So, two educators from Rio Grande do Sul and one educator from the state of São Paulo with a background in linguistics finally in Brazil, after the constitution of '88, going into the Amazon with the Unicuin, or maybe you've heard the name Kashinawa, to instruct them about how to read and write in Portuguese, because finally, in '88, they were acknowledged as human beings, and as human beings, they were entitled to their own cultural heritage. But how do you preserve a cultural heritage in Brazil, according to some kind of Roman idea of how you do that? By writing it. So they go with the best intentions and with a very effective Freirean methodology that starts from the local people, and they fail. And they are wise enough to write about this failure. And this failure has to do with this. So they tell them about words, concepts that they think are very generative, and encourage them to write step by step about it. And these are some of the things they get back. And they realize, I'll cut it very, very short, that we have a book model, repository, myth, when we talk about knowledge. In our mind, it's always which book is the source, which book I'm going to produce in order to negotiate knowledge. But Unicuin, they don't have the book as a reference. They have the anaconda. They have the radical other as depository of knowledge, and that's very effective in terms of how that helps them, not only to read the world they live in, but also to transform at the same time the world and their own community. And when we think that maybe we need to think out of the box, I have never heard in any European Union or even Council of Europe or even UNESCO negotiation. You know, UNESCO can go as far as Uchi, Soto, Ubuntu, but it's also very tokenistic, this type of just translating an African or a Japanese philosophy into a mainly Western framework. Are we prepared to acknowledge very rigorous knowledge construction that descend from cosmologies, from a different relation, from a different resonance with the world around us that goes also beyond the book?
So, thank you, Alessio. If I try to decode your precise answer, yes.
Eat the rich.
Matching the elaboration and answer, I will say maybe yes, maybe no, probably yes. But now we are going on our next speaker. Madam El Guindi, dear Fadwa, there is also consensus between economists that neoliberal economic model is crisis inclined and so unsustainable. On the other hand, behavioral scientists confirm the last 3 decades from empirical studies that people are humans, actually not Homo economicus, which means that people are irrational, inconsistent, and loss averse because losses loom larger than gains. Daniel Kahneman got Nobel Prize for this theory. Obviously, to mitigate polit-crisis, humanity needs new social taxonomy, helping to classify on the new wave drivers of prevailing goals, this time sustainability, both for people and for the planet as a whole. Fadwa, from perspective on anthropology, Are there major differences regarding new social taxonomy definition between developed and developing nations, particularly from your experience with indigenous people? If difference eventually exists, whether this factor could be a new source of polarization and powerful threat to further disintegration of the world. For example, in case of economics, pretext for self-sufficiency, which is now official platform, instead global trade and investment.
Thank you for the question. I just must say that we were instructed by our moderator not to make a presentation, and so I stopped midstream and I stopped my presentation and I'm obeyed, but I see that my colleagues didn't obey, but that's okay. I will just try to wing it. Let me start with the developed and developing. This is no more a classification that is being used, and the world has changed dramatically. And it doesn't seem to have registered in the minds of institutions or thought personalities or even governments and regions themselves that this happened. The change is dramatic. The supremacy that was prevalent by the West over the rest is no more. And the supremacy that was dependent on colonial plunder of the rest of the world is no more. I think that the United States has to rethink itself and accept that reality, and so should Europe. Europe that recently said that they are the garden, whereas Africa is the jungle. I think Europe is the garden because they plundered the jungle. And so they, you know, the jungle now is emerging. It's a very rich jungle, and it's emerging and trying to say, we want our resources back. We want to deal with the resources ourselves. So the change is, the alignments have changed. Instead of the US dominating the world, we have China now, we have Russia, we have North Korea, and with them aligning our, you know, Pakistan, Turkey, Brazil. So even the division of global North, global South doesn't really apply anymore because North and South are being realigned and reconnected in a different way. So there is the challenge to the colonial hold. I think it's still going on. Africa is telling France, get out. We want our country back. And the supremacy based on a certain level of militarism is also being challenged by the presence of entities like Russia and China. And so there has to be an adjustment based on that. The rising Africa, rising Latin America, rising Middle East is also saying to the world that homeland is not real estate. There is another understanding of what homeland is. There is civilization, there is identity, there is feeling, there is culture, there's tradition, something that many of the supremacists don't have actually. But so they want to regain this. It's not real estate where you just build a tower. And I think that this is important that an adjustment would be made on the basis of that. But it looks like the response to that change is very slow. I think that the world is still working on the basis that there is hope. If I get one more drone or one, you know, bomb, I can still continue. Well, no, because everybody can get drones now, and unfortunately, they are all, going back to a race toward having and owning nuclear bombs, not just nuclear facility. And that's because the climate, the environment is pushing them to do so to protect themselves. There is something called nation states. It is based exactly on what the United Nations that was put together under different circumstances, but it was put together for a reason. The members of the United Nations are nations, not people. And so nation states is affirmed as the way the world is divided. And along with nation states, we have sovereignty. So if you encroach on the border of my land, it is my right to try to protect my land. And the old-fashioned colonialism of moving in and taking people's land and justifying ignoring all United Nations principles of human rights and sovereignty rights and so on. This is not acceptable anymore. What is interesting is that those who understood that faster were the people. It's the people who are really moving against their own governments and the borders and united. And thanks to social media, some people see only negative aspects of social media. They are now connecting without the constraints and restraints by the media that are mostly either state-controlled or corporate-controlled or controlled by somebody, and not telling people enough for them to make their own decisions. That's in the past. Social media gives the picture right away. And the people are responding. If you recall, at the time of Vietnam, there was no social media, and there was no movement in America against Vietnam. It's what the government told them. We are doing well, we are winning, and so on, until one day, and talking about art and science, a picture was on television of a child, a baby, being pushed out by the, yes, napalm children, and, you know, was on the beach dead. And the American public rose immediately after this picture. And there were underground movements and movements that changed governments, changed positions, and ended the war eventually. And of course, they ended the war with a failure of the United States in the war. But of course, the president is subject to what the advisors ask him to do. So they told him, go on television and say, we have achieved victory in Vietnam, so we have to get out. There was no victory in Vietnam. There was no victory, actually, for any of these movements. I think that it is important to look at people and the change that's happening among the people, taking on positions independently of their countries. Just consider what's happening now with the Sumut flotilla just about to arrive at Gaza to break the siege. This is people who are organized, almost as good organization as Nebojsa did for our conference, organized all over the world in boats to go and send the message that we are going to break the siege. We are not going to allow people to be hungry, and then we throw some food at them, and while they're eating, we shoot them, or incinerate babies or hit hospitals and hit schools, and this is a violation of everything. So that's where it looks like we are going. But I think we have to consider the factor of the people as an important change going on that has to do with a globalized form of communication. They know what's going on, they react on that basis, and they don't trust the governments anymore. They don't trust the politicians who are lying to them all the time, because they have their own agendas. I mean, the government and nation states have their own agendas. Some part of the agenda is good, some of it is bad, but they have their own agendas. The people are now aware of that. They're also aware about the problems with the notion of democracy, because they were told that, you know, primarily democracy is when you go to the booth and do election, but what when you don't have any choice? As what's happening, what happened in the United States, many people felt we have no choice. And so it moved in a certain direction, not by democratic forces, but by lack of choice. And I think the young people, the people in general, old and young, just lost trust in those governments and those borders and so on, and are taking the world in their own hands and introducing change. So that's, I think, the brief answer to the question about the, where the world is going. And the main point here is for the powerful, dominant nations to recognize that the world is changing and that we have to live together with certain groups. Not love, it's not about love, and it's not really about humanity, it's about benefits for all sides and achieving peace. They can live together in peace without, you know, having drones over them all the time. So I think that this is a major change that sometimes maybe sociologists or economists are just still talking about certain models, but the reality is now different, and we have to live with it, confront it, and encourage the powerful nations to recognize the change.
Thank you. We just complete the first round, and with sharing, let me say, provocative and inspiring ideas from different perspectives. Now we are on the brink of the second round. We will continue on the same 10 minutes discussion framework, but we will use reverse order. In accounting, this is a LIFO method, last in, first out, which means that last speaker from the first round will be the first speaker on the second round. So Fadwa, you are the first speaker in the second round. Fadwa, there is old saying that nothing is possible to define without people. You can probably agree. But nothing is possible to realize without institutions. Institutions cannot and should not reflect the world as is, but the world as it has to be. No doubt, in search for sustainable future, humanity needs a comprehensive overhaul of proposition that address the root causes of human mindfulness. And this is also the area of your interest. My question is going to be, how implement radical idea in mind setting, keeping in mind that radical change doesn't come spontaneous? What makes indigenous people influence in this process unique? For example, support for circular and regenerative economy, which is deeply rooted in the mindset of indigenous people. What do you think about this dilemma?
indigenous knowledge somewhere there in your question? Or
Sorry?
No. Let me again try to improvise here and answer the question. But let me start with what anthropology is. The reason is I think it is misunderstood. It's classified with the social scientists, the periodical of the National Academy of Sciences now puts it at anthropological sciences, and I understand why. It's not really quite social science, it's not, you know, economics, it's not sociology. So what is anthropology? Anthropology was conceived as a study of humankind. It was recognized right away by the founding anthropologists that in order to study humankind, you have to look at all the aspects of humankind. Humankind is complex. It has its cultural, societal, biological, linguistic, cognitive. So how do you do that? And this is the goal of anthropology, to study humankind, not just its society, not just sustainability in the societal fashion, but humankind. How do we increase understanding about humankind? And so in order to implement that idea in the United States, it was decided that we have to have social cultural anthropology, biological or physical anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and even cognitive anthropology, and archaeology, all together for the students who are studying to be anthropologists to get the knowledge from all in one department. Now, Europe didn't do that. Europe chose another line where archaeology was in a different department and so on. But the vision in the United States, and I'm a product of that training, and there are few departments now, large departments, who are still what we call four-field departments. In other words, you cannot get a PhD in anthropology, which takes about an average of 10 years, without being examined and knowledge in all these fields. It does not mean that we have to be experts in all the fields. That is, we don't, single anthropologists don't have to engage in research in all these fields, but they cannot negate the knowledge and the findings in all fields. So you are examined in all of that so that you know what archaeology has, what is the knowledge and research in archaeology tells us, and what biological anthropology tells us. We cannot be cultural anthropologists and make statements that violate the research conclusions from the other fields. Okay, that makes it quite distinct. But what it produces in the end is a particular perspective and a particular gaze. We have to take in consideration local understandings of their own culture. And that required that students would go to what we call the field, which is our laboratory. We go to the field and spend immersive, long, engaging time with a particular population. Whether the situation is primitive society or something else, this is how you're supposed to do it to be an anthropologist. And this immersive relationship gets you so close to an understanding of people's understanding of the world. So, do we take this local knowledge and just write it up? No. We take local knowledge in consideration in our analysis to write it up. So we still have to use the knowledge from ethnography around the world. That is what other anthropologists have given us. and all the other aspects. So the analysis in the end takes in consideration people's knowledge, but does not present, it's just not a spokesperson for the people, because people anywhere sometimes just justify what they do. That doesn't mean that's what they do. And so anthropologists are aware of that. Another thing that they develop through this immersive relationship is a particular gaze. That is, you have a phenomenon going on, you put a political scientist, a sociologist, an economist, a journalist, and they will be seeing something different from what the anthropologist will see. The minute the anthropologist looks at the phenomenon, they see something that is informed by all that training and all that 100 years of research and knowledge. And so they have a particular perspective. That doesn't make them superior. I'm just telling you what anthropology is, because we tend to equate it with sociology. So that takes us to where indigenous knowledge is. Now it's becoming very fashionable to say, let's take in consideration indigenous views. It's almost like a fad. And so we have science, which is mostly the West, and indigenous knowledge, which is the bongo, the people who we were getting the resources before. That's not the perspective I adopt. That is, any local population has both science and local knowledge. So the West has its scientists, its expertise, it's a specialty. You study it, you know what to do. There's a fantastic book on the Valley Zapotec, and the book is called Zapotec Science, and it shows how a farmer knows about the crops better than anybody coming by college and giving them fertilizers and telling them what to do. And the whole ethnography describes how these farmers are scientists. But not every Zapotec in that community is a scientist. It's a specialty. And so the idea of indigenous knowledge and science applies to the whole world, not that we have the scientists and indigenous people. It's all the same. So I don't know whether I addressed your question or not. But I was invited on this session on the basis of an article I have written, and I called it Security Relativized. But if I rewrite it now, I call it Rainbow and Beer instead, because it covered how we had the World Cup in Qatar, but no media covered it. Had this been in Berlin or Moscow or the United States, it would have been big coverage, but because it's in Qatar, it wasn't covered. But side aspects of that was that France was insisting that all the athletes and spectators would put the rainbow whatever on their arms, and Qatar said no, absolutely not. And it's not because they are against any of these sexual orientations, it's just it's not part of their tradition. It's not that there is no homosexuality, there is, and it's recognized and integrated in the system in the Gulf, but it's not this way. It's not we go on and we say we are proud all to be transvest. So Qatar said no, and then they said you have to have beer in the stadiums, and Qatar said no, this is against our Islamic tradition and we're not going to have beer in the stadium. And they in fact succeeded, and it was FIFA recognized that World Cup in Qatar as one of the most successful World Cups ever, because the people rose and supported Qatar in its decisions, and they were going to the to the marketplace, to the souk, and buying the traditional clothes of Qatar, and the Qatari emir recognized the winner by putting the Qatari clothing embroidered in gold, and there was tradition all over the place. There was hospitality, people coming out of their homes. Of course, there's hospitality with prosperity, and so they are going out of the homes with food, giving all the spectators from all around the world free food, Qatari food, and so on. And that, to me, is very important because it represents what I was saying. That is, first of all, it's the people who appreciated such an important event. Qatar prevailed in establishing its tradition. We're not gonna, just because we're joining a particular international event, we don't have to subscribe to your views of what your values. We have our own values, etc. So on that note, I shall.
Thank you. Thank you, Fadwa. I'm always fascinated with the standpoints of people coming from some scientific perfectionists known meta-science. It's very useful for big science and for other social, humanitarian, and behavioral sciences, as you colorfully explained. Alessio, it could be postulated that integration of big science from one side and humanitarian, behavioral, and social sciences from other side is a magic formula for success in this transition period. It is obviously that we need co-creation and contextualization with valuable insights from all parts of science. But sometimes scientific field impacted character of people. So scientists in fundamental or basic science regularly tend to be optimistic in finding solutions from problems. While social scientists, particularly an economist, Nebojsa and I are good examples, are skeptics. Alessio, my question to you is maybe provocative. Could we consider psychologists as constructive skeptics? People understanding the mechanism of decision-making in the human brain and context for these decisions.
Could I call for this one to be set up while I start responding? 66% yes. I think it would be very difficult to be a psychologist or an educator without in-depth sense of hope. Maybe as human beings we're very different, but out of our own personality, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that when we relate to one or several patients, to one or several pupils, the sense of hope, the sense of inspiring desire in our fellow human beings is fundamental. And then maybe we can be pessimistic in our own way, and particularly here I think it's quite understandable that there is always a sense of pessimism of the intelligence. Of course, when we rearm Europe this way, it's not even the Europe we've been putting together, and by that I mean only the European Union, not the overall continent. But that doesn't prevent our own will to to remain optimistic, and that optimism is never just an individual act of will. It is grounded on our ability to establish relations. So I would say until we feel that there is a possibility to regenerate a collective agency, then yes, then yes. Now, this is maybe not accompanying me. Let's see. I'll give you some examples. I mentioned the Chișinău, and I want to go back to this mathematician, very esteemed mathematician, who chose to become an educator out of a very self-critical position. Why did he choose to be interested in physics and in math? I was initially attracted to math and physics because of what I felt to be their role in making the world more intelligible. What is more intelligible? The ability to find patterns and relationships, describing them in words, formulas, theories, being able to communicate patterns and relationships. As you can see, there is a very in-depth affinity in between a psychologist, an educator, and a mathematician. It was fascinating for me to realize, for example, that there is a single principle, the law of gravity, that explains failing apples, rising balloons, the rotation of the moon around the Earth, and tides. You go and read what Fritjof Capra, also from the STEM world, made of Leonardo's writing. Leonardo's writing before Fritjof Capra were considered sort of a mess. Why? Because over the years, Leonardo, who you could consider as specific about the science as we conceive it as Galileo Galilei, was considered by those after him mainly an artist, a beautiful painter. But when you look at what he drew and wrote, there was always a drawing and writings together. And a lot of the writings have not been preserved for different reasons. So putting them back together took some courage to find not just an idea of nodes sketched here and there, but some kind of logic, of mentality, which Capra actually applies very beautifully to Leonardo's writing. And I think that's a very good example of when we have all the data in front of us, or maybe just some of the data. It's a bit like archaeology, but we lack the creativity until a certain point to put it back together because we don't understand, and then psychology comes into place, the mind of that person. Have a look at Capra's book and how many so-called discoveries are already into Leonardo notebook and have been neglected for centuries because there was a sort of laziness, mental laziness in trying to put back the puzzles. So what is very interesting here, I think, and crucial for us is, in Munir Fashe's words, the ability not just to establish relations, but to predict. And to predict is basically very instinctual and very rational, is what you just offered to us. Kahneman's idea that if we don't slow down, if we just react, then we are not good predictors. So maybe we are here because our ancestors were good predictors, basically. Because you stand by a lake and all of a sudden the birds are not singing, and if you're, elsewhere and don't register that signal, you fail to predict what saves your life. We are in the same situation today. What Munir Fashe found was that no matter how beautiful that math and physics was, the way it was taught, the way it was singled out, was neglecting the very scientific knowledge that his illiterate mother had passed down onto him. A tailor that was illiterate, and yet there was plenty of science, and it was not second-hand science. It was not something that trickled down. No, it was coming from, like everywhere, a workshop or a craft type of activity, generation through generation, a very accurate, both holistic and analytical process. And out of that, Munir Fashe goes back and tries to challenge the type of education that was provided, especially in refugee camps or in the West Bank, as some sort of aid. And I remember very clearly when ANC in South Africa, for example, was establishing its own school when everybody was in exile in Tanzania, how much they tried to resemble the British school system. So Fashe was sort of confronted with the very same problem. How come that in order to prove ourselves able to regain independence and autonomy, we imitate the system that is in fact oppressing us? And he has several concepts that in Arabic would need quite a discussion, and I'm not at all an expert in that. But two, I think, is really crucial. Mujawara, which is neighboring, which is commoning, which has been crucial to the Intifada. And I mentioned that with other words, mutihana, a sort of humility in front of the others, something that is also resonant of Ubuntu in Southern Africa. A profound feeling that I am through you, and therefore also your rhythm, your, let's say, way to interact with me and with the environment is fundamentally precious to listen to in terms of our own relationship. Now, I've been a bit listening to some of the words and the tensions that I could detect when it comes to how do we then construct an environment that is conducive to a different type of education, because this is maybe the horizon we want to share. How do we put into tension the kind of things that we see are not good enough to the challenge? And I could see that we've been talking very often about bubbles, but also about trust. I'm not saying one is good, the other one is bad. I'm saying I can see tensions here, and I can see a lot of dialogues across discipline. And a friend of mine says maybe in a pan-disciplinary way, we could try to explore. Another one is market-driven versus participatory, and I go back to, are we sure that if we are quicker and quicker, that's the best way of proceeding? A major tension, I would say, is private versus public. And there, I must apologize, but a lot of data that have been provided here were never mentioned in terms of being private or being public, being copyrighted or being open source, having still sort of accessibility or not. There was a very specific mentioning of Zenodo, and we could mention other platform. I think that that needs also to be some kind of basis that we understand in the doing of our own job. And then I think it was very interesting in times of wars, the mentioning of the Russell Einstein Manifesto and what Truman was saying in '49. For me, what is typical of Truman and what is typical of today is Second World War. The United States of America turned a lot of the corporate, of the enterprise system into warfare. And of course, just after the war, they tried to go back only to escalate it afterwards. And I think when you read carefully, there is a strong link between investing in warfare economy and labeling, basically for the first time in the world, development as the standard, meaning also stages of development and catching up. And I think we have not been deconstructing this enough. Why do we always associate sustainability with development? Isn't development, today a synonym of the growth of the GDP that some scholars here have been very accurately criticizing? And when you read Truman, but especially Eisenhower, you see that not officially, but when talking to colleagues, let me jump. McNamara in '89 speaks directly of a peace dividend. Okay, there is no more this confrontation. We now have a peace dividend because we're investing so much money into war. Go back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was saying, guys, we are investing far too much into warfare, economy, and industries. This is like a drug. There must be a threshold. This is the 50s. Today, we see the results, or being drug addicted. So in the end, this is also about what type of development, and if this development in terms of business as usual or catching up, how much that is contrasting with slow thinking, community relations, and in the end, community flourishing. Acknowledging, for example, that we can't be very quick when dialoguing with a different community in terms of the knowledges, the cosmologies, the relation to nature we are finding there. So I'll suggest, since this is not my field, but it's a type of sociology that comes very much into the psychological field, that what Hartmut Rosa has been proposing as resonance as a core concept, and different layers, different vectors of resonance can be particularly instrumental in order to understand when education is actually resonating, when dialogue is actually resonating with the people involved in that process, and when it is not constructing that type of environment, and definitely it is alienating people. So how much the type of alienation that people feel when it comes to political decision-making as a root in their own non-inclusion in the educational processes. We could stay a lot there, but the point Hartmut Rosa makes, which I think is interesting for us, we were talking a lot about accelerators yesterday with a lot of insights in terms of human relations. Acceleration is very often the motor of alienation when it comes to a group, and for very specific and evident reasons, I think. So here, I think I'm just contributing a general input that might help me to be very short on the references that I'm providing to you. I think we should also pay attention here to the work of the World Health Organization done by, top scientists over the past 10 years in terms of acknowledging the contribution of arts to health. All the evidence, this is strictly an evidence-based process, and you can see Daisy Fancourt, I'm more familiar with her work because it focused more on music, for example. There was a radical change over the past years, also thanks to a lot of the neurologic analysis tools that we have today. So we have plenty of evidence of how we can, in fact, and this is very in line with what I've heard yesterday, construct a different approach to our own health systems, but also intervene and bring science and art together, not just in producing some kind of new tools, but especially in monitoring and sort of sharing a language, and we talk about resonating, that makes teamwork crucial. We've been specializing more and more. Imagine, in my field, music and dance are different fields of therapy. That's crazy. When you look around in the world, people are usually not able to tear apart theater from music, from dance, but we made it. We made it, and it's time to bring it back as a teamwork first, but sometimes also acknowledging how much schooling has basically constricted us. We were talking about CO2, but we should talk about sitting on 2 chairs for hours. What does that to children? This is not okay. This is not healthy. Let's recognize that. It's not healthy physically, it's not healthy mentally, but it's also not healthy socially. And when you see properly, sorry about that again, properly functioning school systems, they take place outside of the school building. So quality education as measured by the SDGs is about books and school buildings, and we need them. I think we need them. But it's what is happening around the school building that matters. And how many schools I've an experience of in Brazil function exactly because the pupils gather at the school building, but go elsewhere the whole day, and the whole morning maybe, and then come back to eat together, and then they enter the school building and realize further work that needs more technology maybe. So there is an whole process, I think, in this report to the WHO that says how much we need a collective, collaboration professionally and socially in bringing science and arts together in creating an health environment, and by that I don't mean just medical interventions, but also the whole prevention sector that starts from education. Now, I will focus and share some references about what we call co-creation, because until now it has been up in the air. My experience is primarily in Brazil and in Argentina, sometimes in other countries, especially in Central South America and 3 countries in Africa. But place education, for example, place-based education is now one of the fields that geographers, that geologists, people that are interested in applying GIS science to designing and to proposing different paths in terms of sustainability are constantly using. Acknowledging exactly what we have heard a moment ago, that generations of very specific, not sometimes general, but locally placed knowledge is crucial if we want to forecast. How many stories do we know from, the colonizers' periods of monoculture, et cetera, failing because they just took into account sort of a 1 or 2 years period of production and not 200 years period, right? So this has become not only a matter of case studies, but something that formally in most financed programs, development banks and international programs, it's now compulsory. And the question here, which I think would be very interesting for reflection, is which case studies are really providing some kind of negotiated knowledge and which examples are just tokenistic. And there, this type of focus, for example here, in the co-production, not just the end result, but what happens in terms of the process, are crucial and can highlight how much this has been a transdisciplinary work. As a psychologist, I'm very familiar with the work of Kurt Lewin, that not by chance, we just heard from anthropologists the word field. Think about it, in the 30s, anthropologists is finally coming with some reference conceptual framework, and Lewin says what we need is a field approach, right? But I think here, it is my background, but it's also a bit of a likeness here. What especially Falsborda in Colombia of the 50s did in founding sociology, but also in acknowledging that sociology up to that moment was basically an urban look at the rest of the world, and founding a sociology from the rural part, from the perspective of peasants. I think that has been crucial. And I'll skip a few of the slides I wanted to share with you. I think that this can be summarized and made accessible across the fields of mapping, designing, and implementing participatory activities, dialoguing with both the scientific and the governing system. But this can also, I think, come down to activities that have proved over and over, especially in Latin America, to be very effective at the school and outside the school. So in the tradition of Freire and Boal, the forum theater and specifically the legislative theater provide plenty of evidence of how you negotiate observation and meaning at the local level, and you provide laws. In the case of Boal, for example, different laws in Rio de Janeiro, in São Paulo, you take the experience of Europe, particularly in Austria, in the UK, and this is something you can realize at school level as well as in the society. And the other tool, I would say, is definitely photo voice, because this is very practical. Pupils, people can take pictures, start to provide their view, their position in society based on a picture. This is not sharing the best pictures, this is really sharing your view, adding comments, and start affinities group based on their own interest, with the ability to communicate with the others on the premises of their own very specific perception. I know I'm out of time, so I'll stay on just a little Padlet that in this case was done by adults, but you have plenty of this and plenty of other digital tools on top of the very physical experience we can share with forum theater, photo voice, and plenty of other tools to realize knowledge co-creation at all levels. Thank you so much.
Nebojsa, I have a question for you. With the aim not penalize Professor Nakicenovic, to expand 5 minutes the panel because we are between yours and the lunch, if I... 10
minutes more.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Alessio, thank you for a priority list of trade-offs. The impact of lateral factors in creation of the phenomenon. It was a perfect overview. Now we will back to economics. We know that green transition require massive funds. According last OECD report, until 2030, between 5.9 and 12 trillion US dollars per year is needed for green transition. Financing such massive investments is under the huge scrutiny of regulators because people are irrational. And massive investments means sometimes environmental crime or widespread non-compliant behavior, commonly referred as green washing. Like brainwashing, but this time dedicated to another problem. It is a global phenomenon in expansion. In the year 2024, for example, greenwashing incidents were identified in 70% of economic agents from finance sector and in 40% of economic agents from real economy. Nebojsa, question to you. How to keep significant level on investment in green transition and simultaneously prevent a low investment in particularly green energy transition? How much progress in this area we can expect in a visible future? And related with previous, whether we achieve energy transition in expense of greater transaction costs, which could put us in a new downfall eventually.
Well, thank you for the question. I would also like to thank Nebojsa for the extra time. So I'll take a couple of minutes to respond. But let me first say that, originally I prepared a presentation for this session. I'm not using the slides, but they're on the computer. Please feel free to download or send me an email. I'll be happy to share. But let me just say what the first slide was, in direction of your question. The first slide was a poster from the March for Science from 2017 in India. And it said, invest in science because that's investing in your future. And that's also true for investing in the energy and many other systems. Investment is about the future. And today we live in a global economy of about 100 trillion, and about 20% goes into investment. So, that's about 20 trillion. So 10 trillion doesn't sound scary if it goes in the right direction. That's the real problem. So I think it's the direction of investment that is the key. And for that, and I think in the spirit of what we have been saying before, I think we need social steering. It cannot be left to the narrow, short-term profit alone. Otherwise, we will not get there where you were suggesting. And I would perhaps go even further. I think we might need a new social contract if you're going to fund and invest in the transformation towards sustainability. And by the way, social contract is the only contract that none of us have ever signed, but we have to obey with it. So it's time to change it in the right direction. So that would be my take. And let me just give you an example of this long-term sustainability issues with a short-term micro-profit orientation. If we take climate, for example, it's clear that we have to decarbonize. There is no doubt about it, and we have to electrify our economy, and you suggested that costs money. There is no doubt about it. At the same time, we are exceedingly late. even if we achieve net zero emissions, meaning having a non-fossil, or at best with some CCS, carbon capture and storage, but renewable energy, we're allowed also nuclear and very high efficiency. If we can even achieve that and have net zero by 2050, we'll be probably stabilizing climate at 3 degrees. I mean, I think that needs to sink in. Last year, we had 1.5 degrees global mean temperature increase over pre-industrial. That's the lower limit of the Paris Agreement. And, you know, in places where we live, I mean, here in Europe, in particular Alpine region, that means it's already 3 degrees. And so 3 degrees globally might mean for us 6 degrees. You have to think about it. And the only way to go down to 1.5 or 2 degrees globally, and it'll take decades, if not a century, is actually to manage this overshoot of temperature, removing carbon from the atmosphere. So this is why the direction of investment, from my point of view, is relatively clear. The trouble is that I think what we have, the market mechanisms that we have in the European Union and everywhere else, are not sufficient given the urgency of the topic. So one of the mechanisms that many of you might be aware of is the EU taxonomy, a corporate sustainability reporting directive, to make sure that what the private sector does is aligned with the sustainability goals. This is all exceedingly important. I'm not arguing against it, but it's not enough. It's by leaps and bounds not enough, because as I said, you know, shareholder value, short-term profit maximization is a completely different thing. And from that perspective, these investments might appear to be unaffordable if you want to make profit in the short term. However, socially, I think they're attractive and affordable if we have the long-term vision and aspiration like the sustainability goals or European Green Deal. So that's what I would like to argue with. And the other thing is greenwashing. That's really important because one can frame it as a negative externality. The more greenwashing we have, the more people escape from moving in the right direction. I think the more we will endanger the transformation and we'll have business as usual, which I think we all agree that it will not work. So, you know, we cannot leave this to the invisible hand of the market alone. And the reason is very simple. Invisible hand does not exist. So we really need big social push in the direction of decarbonization, electrification, and so on. And so let me try to illustrate what might be affordable, even from the investment point of view. So what all of these things that we need to do, in my view, have in common is relatively high upfront investment, but exceedingly low long-term costs. That's quite different to technologies we are using today. So think about it. Photovoltaics, you invest, you put it on your roof, and then you have very low costs. That is also true with wind. It's true with efficiency. You have to invest up front. Later on, you have low costs, low emissions. So sufficiency as well. Overconsumption needs to be cut. It costs almost nothing, but it does require new values, new norms, and so on. So what I'm arguing for is if we have a long-term vision, agreed vision that's socially steered, then I think the investment will come. For example, insurance companies, pension funds, they all should have long-term orientation. And so there's plenty of money out there. The problem is that how to make sure it goes in the right direction. So let me give you a personal example, and then I think I'll come to conclusion. About 10 years ago, I served on UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's high-level group on energy and climate. And I made the same argument I'm making now 10 years ago. Nothing has changed for me. And the one person who was on the committee, who was the CEO of a very large but unnamed energy company, said to me, "Naki, you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. We make all of our money from the volatility, and you're arguing against the volatility, you're arguing along the long-termism and clear orientation." So I think we need a real paradigm change to have the investments go in that direction. So all of these things I talked about, you know, whether it's wind, whether it's photovoltaics, these are, I call them, or in the literature, they're called granular systems. These are the systems that can be replicated at a very fast rate, and then, you know, they can be scaled up. It can allow for a very fast diffusion. As a metaphor, think of the mobile phone. Everybody in the world has a mobile phone after 30 years. I call it democratic technology. It's the only one that everybody has. Tragically, even the billion or so people who do not have access to electricity, they have a mobile phone. And so this is similar to the technologies I'm talking about. They're granular in nature. That means they have very high learning effects because you can multiply them. As an example, photovoltaics over the decades already, every time the global capacity of photovoltaic cells doubled, the costs went down by 20%. So if we go in this direction, not only is this profitable in the long run, it is also the cost will go down, radically go down. So that would be my answer, how to attract I know it's a little bit blue-eyed because you would have to change the whole system, but that would be my take on how one needs to revamp the system so that there is ample investment going in what I would call the right direction. So I think I will come to conclusion. We ran out of the time, but I can't resist, since I have the floor, to take up the topic you said, just for 1 minute, what Fatma said, you know, about the Vietnam War. I studied in the US during the Vietnam War, and we did protest. We had a huge movement. We even closed the university down at that time. And then I had a teleconference a few days ago with some of the surviving colleagues from back there, from 50 years ago, who said, do you realize that if we would do this today, we might all end up in El Salvador? And I was not even evicted. I could complete my studies in the US. So all I'm trying to say is that surveillance capitalism, some of those new technologies also have this dark side. I agree with the bright side, but I think they also have a dark side. And that's yet another reason, I think, for social steering and a new social contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, clock ticking quickly, so we are at the end of the panel, and I can only say that along promises humanity needs premises. In that regards, what we really need is the manifesto for planet-centric future of social economical system, respecting both planet's natural limits and natural laws, because socio-economic system is only one layer of so-called system dynamics. Also, from perspective of behavioral sciences, particularly, and anthropology, we can say that we must equalize some problems regarding STEM and AI consequences towards dehumanization of work. So finding real arguments from social, humanitarian, and behavioral sciences in that regard is on critical importance. Economists get a puzzle on the right way, and this is no way possible. Thank you so much for the time. So now we are in a lunchtime.